それではグレグソン中将からお願いいたします。
Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be here, and konnichiwa and good afternoon to all in the audience. The topic before us today is very broad indeed, and I will make 3 points. Security must be a national issue, not a local issue. It must be integrated with other national issues, specifically the 3/11 recovery, and security activities must contribute to Japanese national economic restoration, a third opening to match the Meiji restoration and the post-war economic resurgence. Secretary Clinton said, "One of the most important tasks of American statecraft over the next decade will therefore be to lock in a substantially increased investment, diplomatic, economic, strategic, and otherwise, in the Asia-Pacific region. Our strategy calls for active alliances with full sharing of responsibilities and forces that are well integrated and adaptive to challenges. This reaffirms our Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security of 1960, validated through many changes in the 52 years since it was signed. That treaty requires the U.S. to not only assure the defense of Japan, but also to contribute to the security of Asia, thereby establishing the environment that supports the security and prosperity of Japan. Japan's growing active role in national and international security affairs is essential. Okinawa has always figured very prominently in Japanese security calculations. As late as the last half of the 19th century, Okinawa existed as the independent Ryukyu Kingdom. Indeed, it had separate diplomatic reception chambers at Shuri Castle for Chinese and Japanese diplomats. It was considered better that China and Japan not be formally aware that the kingdom was paying tribute to two nations. Commodore Matthew Perry made port at Naha in May of 1853 before calling on the mainland. One local historian remarked on his calculated incivility. During the Meiji period, Japan sought to limit Western penetration while Japan modernized. China was dominated by Western commercial and political interests, and the Qing dynasty was doomed. Meiji wanted a barrier against similar Western penetration while Japan modernized. Japan assumed control of the Ryukyu Kingdom. 1945 brought annexation by the United States through the greatest air, land, and sea battle in world history. General Uchijima did his job, extending the land battle as long as possible while Japan mounted an extended and effective aerial campaign through suicidal attacks on the Allied fleet, over 1,000 ships supporting the U.S. forces ashore. Tenno-zan was one descriptive Japanese word applied to this all-out gamble to force a negotiated peace. It resulted in tremendous casualties, military and civilian. Prime Minister Noda's recent report of his Okinawa visit paid tribute to this sacrifice. Peace was thought to be at hand. The United States quickly withdrew from Europe and Asia and rapidly demobilized. But peace was not to be. Between 1945 and 1950, the Soviet Union blockaded Berlin and exploded an atomic weapon. Another wartime ally, nationalist China under Chiang Kai-shek, was defeated and retreated to Taiwan. In June of 1950, the Army of North Korea under Kim Il-sung invaded the Republic of Korea. Communist forces threatened to quickly take control of all of Korea, a clear threat to Japan that could not be allowed. The U.S. quickly returned to Asia to protect the small corner of South Korea that remained around Busan. After containing the North Korean advance, U.S. and Allied forces landed at Incheon on Korea's west coast. The invasion force included Japanese minesweepers and amphibious ships with Japanese crews. A new relationship was born. Since those tough days in 1945 and the early days of the Cold War, Japan executed a miraculous recovery. In these days of economic challenge, we need to recall that it was Japan who led the original economic boom in Asia. Today, we are challenged again with economic issues as well as security challenges. Other nations seek access to resources, oil, gas, and fish in Japan's exclusive economic zone. The South and the East China Seas are the commercial center of the world. Over 1,100 fully laden supertankers cross these seas every year, bringing energy to Northeast Asia. 50% of the world's seaborne commercial tonnage and 1/3 of the world's value in trade traverse these seas. The eastern boundary of the East China Sea is Japanese territory, specifically Okinawa Prefecture, located along an arc between mainland Japan and Taiwan. China challenges Japanese claims to Okinawa's Senkaku Islands. Some in China even call for the annexation of Okinawa Prefecture. While Chinese forces are growing, it's likely that economic conditions will mean that U.S. and Japanese forces are likely to, at best, remain at their current levels. We must enhance the effectiveness of our alliance security operations to ensure security and freedom of navigation. Prime Minister Noda made the same point in the Wall Street Journal on Monday. Speaking to National Defense Academy graduates, he said, "Circumstances in our surrounding regions are increasingly severe, complicated, and remain uncertain, as depicted in moves by North Korea, including nuclear and missile issues, and China, which is reinforcing its military capabilities and continuing activities in surrounding waters." Forces in Okinawa, Japanese and U.S., must provide this needed security. A few principles of U.S. force deployment should be stated to put this in context. We deploy forces overseas to operate in support of the policy and strategy of the United States. We do this with the active cooperation and support of our allies and friends. Military and naval bases are very useful things. They make a profound political statement long before they make a military statement. Any presence of foreign forces in another country requires a compromise of various principles of sovereignty on the part of both countries involved. Any such presence is a strong validation, at some cost, of commitment to common security goals. Removing that presence, particularly from a disputed area, creates a vacuum and a perception of lack of commitment. Bases are very useful and cost-effective means to develop, train, and maintain forces. Bases should also support alliance training and development. Bases also provide valuable deployment platforms and support for forces operating throughout the region. U.S. forces overseas have an important deterrent role, but the role of our forward deployed forces is far broader and more constructive than simply waiting for conflict. Broad, active, widely distributed presence throughout the Asian theater dampens sources of instability, deters conflict, gives substance to U.S. security commitments, and ensures continuing access of all nations to the region. The presence and the efforts of our forces help shape the regional geopolitical climate, and they remain immediately available to respond if needed. Let's be specific about Okinawa. The entire prefecture consists of hundreds of islands extending from the mainland of Japan to within sight of Taiwan. Together, these islands establish much of Japan's exclusive economic zone and access to seabed resources. The Nansei Shoto, the older name, is a vast area, mostly ocean, but with a handful of inhabited islands. In simplest terms, military operations in this sort of environment require a combined sea, air, ground strategy using Navy, Marine, Air Force, and Army units, and air, maritime, and ground self-defense forces in a coordinated and highly mobile fashion. Modern warfare is a combined arms business. Air, naval, and ground forces each can do what the other cannot. Their effectiveness is directly proportional to their ability to integrate and operate together. Operating alone, no single service can adequately protect the region. Operating together, they can. Too often overlooked, Nansei Shoto defense presents a need to seize and hold territory and eject invaders. This requires ground forces operating within a joint force, and they must be able to conduct amphibious operations. Not surprisingly, the Chinese understand this. There is a reason why the Chinese People's Liberation Army has a Marine Corps and is strengthening it. The Marine Corps is a mix of ground, sea, and air capabilities. It has a close, mutually supportive relationship with the United States Navy that goes back over 200 years, with the Navy providing various types of support, including air and fire support, transport, supply, and logistics. Admiral Willard, the just retired commander of Pacific Command, used his final testimony to the U.S. Congress and the American people to declare that the Marines stationed in Japan are a critical part of all of our contingency plans in the region. The Marines bring along infantry, artillery, assault vehicles, wheeled and air transport, logistics, and their own air cover in the form of helicopters and first-line jet aircraft. This well-designed Navy-Marine Corps joint combined arms team mixing complementary sea, air, and ground capabilities is ideally suited for the Nansei Shoto region. Warfare is complicated and three-dimensional, and if one hopes to win and at the lowest possible cost in lives, it should not be done on a cheap or with one service trying to outshine the others. Okinawa Prefecture basing, including Futenma or its replacement, remains essential. Moving Okinawa-based forces away creates a vacuum and a perceived lack of commitment, in addition to simply being much further away from the Nansei Shoto. Time and distance matter in military operations and in an opponent's calculations. We should jointly base U.S. and Japanese self-defense forces at facilities, both present and future, in the Okinawa Prefecture. The benefits are operational, psychological, and political. If a replacement for Futenma Air Station is ever built, it will ideally be a joint base along the lines of Iwakuni and Atsugi, rather than a U.S.-owned and run operation. This is better politically and operationally given the familiarity and improved interoperability and increased bilateral training that come from living and working together. I said earlier that national security must be a national responsibility. The leadership of Japan and the United States must clearly state the national security rationale for the Alliance Transformation and Realignment Agreement. Our national leaders must also make the case for how the agreement can enable the economic revival of not only Okinawa Prefecture, but of all of Japan, and specifically how this can aid the recovery of the Tohoku area. Domestically and economically, the 895 hectares of property slated for conversion to civilian use should be used to aggressively leverage development in Okinawa and Japan, exploiting cutting-edge economic and educational activities to lead economic resurgence, providing needed resources for the speedy rebuilding of Tohoku and for Japanese economic resurgence. Thank you.
グレグソン中将、本当にありがとうございました。時間内で収めていただきまして、これからのディスカッションにも大変助けになります。